In Confidence Men, Maggie Haberman, a journalist for the New York Times, provides a deep dive into the remarkable public life and career of Donald Trump, real estate mogul, reality TV star, and the 45th President of the United States. Haberman explores the people, experiences, and environments that shaped the unique personality that defined Trump's presidency. At the heart of her portrayal is his remarkable ability as a showman and salesman, driven by a profound need for fame, attention, power, and control over others. This summary will examine key moments in Donald Trump's life, from his ascent as a real estate developer who crafted an image of himself as the embodiment of capitalist success, to his transformation into a right-wing firebrand, promoting conspiracy theories and challenging the political establishment. It will also explore his stunning and unexpected victory in the 2016 presidential election, which defied all conventional wisdom, as well as his tumultuous presidency, particularly his attempts to overturn the 2020 election results and the political turmoil that followed. Part 1: Trump's Early Years, 1946 to 1983. To understand the unique personality that Donald Trump would become, Maggie Haberman argues that it's essential to look at his formative years. In this section, we explore how his family environment, the New York City of his youth, and his early business and political connections all played a pivotal role in shaping the men who would later rise to power. Life in the Trump family. Donald Trump was born in 1946 to Fred and Mary Trump. His father, Fred, had established the Trump Organization, which built a modest real estate empire focused on middle-class housing in Brooklyn and Queens. Haberman emphasizes that the Trump family was characterized by emotional distance, harshness, and a lack of empathy. Fred Trump, in particular, instilled in his children a fiercely competitive, win-at-all-costs mentality, fostering a deep sense of rivalry among them that would stay with Donald throughout his life. Learning the transactional nature of relationships. Haberman writes that growing up in the Trump household, Donald Trump quickly learned that relationships were transactional. People were only valuable if they could offer something in return. This mindset, she argues, was deeply ingrained in the world of New York real estate in which Trump was raised. His father, Fred, was a master at cultivating political connections with local party leaders, elected officials, and judges, and these relationships were essential for securing the tax breaks, easements, and permits needed for the family's real estate projects. Donald Trump took these lessons to heart when he joined the family business in 1968 after graduating from the University of Pennsylvania. In the 1970s, he began to establish his own network, forging ties with key Manhattan power brokers, including then-Mayor Abe Beame. These connections proved invaluable, helping the Trump Organization secure around $168 million in tax abatements from city and state governments, an early example to Trump of how the right political connections could unlock immense wealth and power. A template for fighting criticism and attacking critics. The Trump Organization encountered legal trouble early in Donald Trump's career when it was sued by the Justice Department in 1973 for allegedly discriminating against black tenants. In response, the Trumps enlisted Roy Cohn, a notorious New York lawyer and political power broker. The partnership proved successful, although the Trump Organization was required to sign a legal agreement promising to end discriminatory practices. It was never forced to admit any wrongdoing. Haberman notes that Cohn's aggressive approach to the lawsuit, characterized by fiery pushback and relentless counterattacks, would establish a template for how Donald Trump would handle criticism and opposition throughout his career. This combative strategy would become a hallmark of his public persona, whether in business, politics, or personal matters. Cultivating a public image. By the late 1970s, Trump was emerging as a rising star in New York's business world. Haberman notes that during this time, he began carefully crafting a public image as a dynamic, forward-thinking businessman with an air of confidence and swagger. Trump believed that positioning himself this way would make him a symbol of success and prosperity. Haberman writes that Trump instinctively understood the importance of media relations to his real estate empire, recognizing that being seen as popular and well-liked could benefit his business. To that end, he made a concerted effort to immerse himself in New York's elite social scene, rubbing shoulders with celebrities and feeding salacious stories to the press, all in an effort to build his public persona. Trump's public image received a significant boost with the completion of Trump Tower in 1983, a highly publicized luxury building located on Manhattan's prestigious Fifth Avenue. Its prominent location placed him at the center of New York's financial and cultural elite. Although Trump resented the cultural establishment for viewing him as crass and unsophisticated, he simultaneously craved their approval and acceptance. Haberman points out that this love-slash-hate relationship with traditional elites would continue to shape his actions and attitudes throughout his later political career. Trump's resentment toward Manhattan's old guard cultural elite mirrored the frustrations of another ambitious figure who would later reach the White House, Richard Nixon. In Nixonland, historian Rick Perlstein examines Nixon's early political development, particularly focusing on his division of the American public into two groups, the Franklins and the Orthogonians. Perlstein explains that the highly intelligent but socially awkward Nixon felt excluded as a college student by a group of confident, well-connected students known as the Franklins. In response, Nixon created the Orthogonians, a group for ambitious individuals like himself, those who sought success through hard work and perseverance rather than social ease. Nixon channeled these resentments into a populist appeal, aligning himself with the white middle class, whom he saw as the Orthogonians on a national scale, and rallying them against the perceived elites. Decades later, Trump would adopt similar rhetoric, portraying himself as an outsider who resented and fought against elites, intellectuals, and globalists, a theme we will explore in more detail later in this summary. In Part 2 of the book, Haberman shifts her focus to Trump's life and career from the 1980s through the 2000s, highlighting the solidification of his public image as both a symbol of capitalist success and excess. During the 1980s, Trump actively crafted his persona as a flamboyant, sexually adventurous, and self-made real estate tycoon, a narrative that resonated with the public and elevated him to national prominence as a symbol of wealth and opulence. At the same time, his views on race and crime were shaped by the volatile social landscape of 1980s New York City. Despite facing severe financial troubles in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Trump managed to rebound in the 2000s with the success of The Apprentice, a reality TV show that reintroduced him to the public as a larger-than-life figure. Haberman writes that Donald Trump's upbringing in a highly segregated New York City ingrained in him enduring stereotypes about people of color and other historically marginalized groups. These views, she argues, shaped his interactions throughout his life. When Trump began working with black and brown communities in the 1970s and 1980s, he saw them less as groups of individuals with agency and more as interest groups to be courted and won over. Operating from this perspective, he forged transactional relationships with black athletes and community leaders, often highlighting these associations as proof of his supposed acceptance within the black community. Trump's insistence that his personal relationships with people of color should shield him from accusations of racial animosity highlights a key distinction between individual and institutional racism. In White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo defines institutional racism as the systemic imbalances in the social, political, cultural, economic, and legal power structures of society. White people, as the group historically in control of power in America, benefit materially and psychologically from this racial hierarchy. Trump, like all white individuals raised in a racially conscious society, is shaped by the assumptions embedded in an institutionally racist system, regardless of whether he sees himself as personally racist. By pointing to his associations with individual people of color as proof of his non-racism, Trump may be falling into the trap that DiAngelo argues many white people do, narrowly defining racism as a personal or individual flaw. For them, racism is simply something done by mean-spirited people, often manifesting as overt hostility toward people of color. However, DiAngelo contends that focusing on whether an individual white person is racist misses the larger point of how racism operates on a systemic level. Haberman writes that the 1980s in New York City provided Trump with what he saw as ample confirmation of his stereotyped worldview. The city was grappling with high crime rates, driven in part by the crack epidemic and the ensuing wave of violent street crime. The public discourse around crime was highly racialized, with violent crime often being associated with African Americans. According to Haberman, Trump, influenced by tough-on-crime figures like Philadelphia Mayor Frank Rizzo, publicly championed harsh, punitive policies against criminals. This stance, she argues, would become a defining characteristic of his later political approach. Some scholars argue that the rise and fall of violent crime in the United States can be linked to lead exposure in children. They point to a correlation between elevated levels of lead in the environment, particularly from leaded gasoline, and the surge in crime rates during the mid-20th century. The central idea is that childhood lead exposure contributes to cognitive impairment and behavioral problems, which could increase the likelihood of criminal behavior later in life. Research on the neurotoxic effects of lead highlights its detrimental impact on brain development, impulse control, and decision-making. The hypothesis suggests that individuals born in the 1940s and 1950s, who were exposed to high levels of lead, were more likely to engage in criminal behavior as they entered adulthood in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. In contrast, the decline in crime rates since the 1990s coincides with the phasing out of leaded gasoline and a subsequent reduction in environmental lead exposure. A financial decline. Haberman notes that despite his high-profile public image, by the late 1980s, Trump's financial situation was in decline, primarily due to his lavish spending and overpaying for properties. His Atlantic City casino, the Trump Taj Mahal, which he had acquired through heavy debt financing, became a financial disaster. As Trump's financial troubles mounted, the Wall Street Journal reported in 1990 that he had a negative net worth of $294 million. In 1991, his casinos filed for bankruptcy, forcing him to restructure his debt with the banks. Yet, despite these severe financial challenges, Trump managed to retain control of his company and avoid personal bankruptcy. Launching The Apprentice. In January 2004, Trump's career took a major turn with the debut of the reality television show The Apprentice, as Haberman notes. The show featured teams competing in business challenges, with Trump serving as the judge and final arbiter. The winner of each season earned a job in the Trump Organization. The show became a major success, playing a key role in reviving Trump's image as a tough, no-nonsense business tycoon. It introduced his now iconic catchphrase, "You're fired," and presented him to a new generation as a savvy, larger-than-life businessman capable of getting results. Part 3. Emerging on the Political Scene, 2009 to 2016. After tracing Donald Trump's rise, fall, and resurgence from the 1980s through the 2000s, Haberman details his emergence as a political force during Barack Obama's presidency. This section examines his embrace of social media, particularly his promotion of the birther conspiracy against Obama, the launch of his 2016 presidential campaign, and his effective use of media to dominate the Republican nomination race. Ultimately, Trump's rise culminated in his victory over Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. Spreading the birther conspiracy. In 2009, Trump joined Twitter under the handle @RealDonaldTrump, quickly mastering the platform to generate controversy and grab attention. By 2011, he became the leading proponent of the birther conspiracy, falsely claiming that President Obama was born outside the U.S. and therefore ineligible for office. Haberman notes that while the conspiracy was baseless, it resonated with many in the Republican Party, tapping into cultural fears, resentments about a changing America, and a desire to discredit Obama and his supporters. Launching the campaign. In June 2015, Trump officially announced his presidential run with a controversial speech that included inflammatory remarks about Mexican immigrants, calling them rapists, and advocating for a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico. Haberman notes that Trump's campaign quickly adopted a carnival-like atmosphere, featuring stunts and confrontations that generated intense media coverage while sidelining his rivals. Despite widespread backlash, Trump's campaign gained momentum among Republican voters, who were drawn to his combative style and his clashes with the press, protesters, and fellow candidates. The roots of Trump's appeal. Haberman argues that Trump effectively capitalized on the deepening polarization in America. The erosion of trust in elites, fueled by events like 9/11, the Iraq War, and the financial crisis, combined with white racial and ethnic resentment following the election of the first black president, created a fertile environment for Trump's confrontational, resentment-driven politics. His false claims, such as the birther theory about Obama and his derogatory remarks about Mexican immigrants, tapped into this cultural resentment. When mainstream media criticized him, Trump doubled down, portraying himself as a victim of a liberal smear campaign. This strategy turned the media's attacks into a rallying cry, strengthening his connection with his base. The perceived decline of America as a white Christian nation. Research into white cultural resentment suggests that the decline of white Christians as a demographic majority in the U.S. has sparked anxiety and nostalgia for a time when they played a more dominant role in shaping the nation's culture and identity. As this demographic shift continues, many white Christians feel a sense of cultural and racial displacement. Political scientists argue that these anxieties contribute to Trump's strong appeal among white evangelical voters, who have consistently supported him. 85% of the evangelical vote went to Trump in the 2020 election, making them his most loyal constituency. The general election. Haberman notes that after finishing second in the Iowa caucuses, Trump went on a winning streak, securing victories in New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, which gave him a commanding lead in delegates and solidified his position as the GOP frontrunner. By May, he had clinched the Republican nomination and selected Indiana Governor Mike Pence as his running mate, setting the stage for the general election against Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton. Despite a tumultuous and controversial campaign, Trump defied expectations, ultimately winning the presidency on November 8, 2016, in a shocking political upset. GOP elites and the failure to protect democracy. In How Democracies Die, political scientists Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky argue that Trump's campaign posed a unique threat to democracy due to his blatant hostility toward traditional democratic norms, an attitude not seen before in a major party nominee. They contend that the Republican Party failed to stop Trump's rise and, once he became the nominee, failed to oppose him. Despite his early lack of major endorsements, Trump's celebrity status and backing from right-wing media figures like Sean Hannity and Coulter allowed him to bypass traditional party structures and connect directly with voters, securing a string of primary victories. Ziblatt and Levitsky also highlight the GOP's inability to block Trump at the convention, even after some party members attempted to change the rules and unbind delegates pledged to him. This left GOP leaders with a dilemma in the general election: oppose Trump and risk a party defeat, or support him and jeopardize the survival of democracy. Ultimately, they argue, GOP elites chose party over country, siding with Trump and prioritizing partisan interests over the democratic process by refusing to support Hillary Clinton. Part 4, In the White House, 2017 to 2021. In this section, Maggie Haberman delves into the inner workings of Donald Trump's presidency, focusing on the policy disputes, personal rivalries, and major events that defined his time in office. Central to this period was Trump's chaotic leadership style, his disregard for traditional political norms, and his administration's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as his ultimate defeat in the 2020 presidential election and his refusal to accept the results. A chaotic leadership style. Haberman highlights how Trump's presidency was marked by internal factionalism and power struggles. Figures like Steve Bannon, a populist right-wing ideologue, were often pitted against more moderate figures, including Trump's daughter Ivanka Trump and her husband Jared Kushner. This constant infighting was, according to Haberman, something Trump seemed to thrive on, feeding into his need for drama and conflict. Rather than focusing on policy or governance, Trump appeared more interested in the trappings of the presidency, flying on Air Force One, attending state dinners, and meeting with celebrities. His public persona, it seemed, was more important to him than engaging in the formal responsibilities of the job, such as collaborating with Congress, shaping legislative agendas, or guiding substantive policy initiatives. This lack of focus on policy and legislative action contributed to a presidency that achieved few major legislative accomplishments. For instance, Trump's long-standing promise to repeal the Affordable Care Act, one of Obama's signature achievements, remained unfulfilled despite years of attempts. Haberman argues that this absence of concrete legislative direction further fueled criticism of Trump's chaotic leadership style. Without a clear governing agenda, the administration's focus often seemed to drift between spectacle and the ever-present media attention that followed Trump's every move. The 2019 impeachment. Haberman argues that a significant breach of norms took place in 2019. On July 25 of that year, President Trump made a phone call to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, pressuring him to investigate Joe Biden, who was not only a former vice president but also a potential 2020 opponent. Haberman notes that during the conversation, Trump hinted he might withhold military aid from Ukraine if Zelensky didn't initiate the investigation. This led House Democrats to impeach Trump, accusing him of blackmailing a foreign ally. Trump's supporters presented several arguments against his 2019 impeachment. They contended that the case lacked concrete evidence, arguing that the transcripts of his phone call with Zelensky didn't clearly establish a quid pro quo. They also criticized the impeachment process, claiming it was unfair and lacked transparency, particularly due to the closed-door hearings led by the Democratic-controlled House Intelligence Committee, which they argued denied Trump proper due process. Additionally, they argued that there was no clear impeachable offense, emphasizing that even if Trump's actions were inappropriate, they didn't rise to the level of an offense warranting impeachment, and stressed the distinction between misconduct and actions that justified removal from office. Some defenders suggested that the impeachment was motivated by political considerations, pointing out that it came just before the 2020 election and claiming that Democrats were more focused on political strategy than on upholding the law. Lastly, they raised national security concerns, arguing that the impeachment inquiry diverted attention from critical issues and weakened the president's ability to manage foreign policy effectively. Haberman argues that the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in February 2020 represented a critical turning point for the Trump administration. While the pandemic was a grave national crisis requiring strong, decisive leadership, Trump's response was more focused on how the situation affected him personally. He became frustrated with the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, and other health officials who were sounding the alarm about the growing pandemic. Rather than addressing the crisis head-on, he pushed his administration to downplay the severity of the situation and limit public warnings, even as the number of infections and deaths continued to rise. Although Haberman describes Trump's response to the pandemic as misguided, ineffective, and uncaring, his administration, along with Congress, implemented a swift and significant legislative response to the crisis. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, CARES Act, signed into law by Trump in March 2020, was a $2 trillion relief package aimed at addressing the economic impact of the pandemic. Even some progressive commentators called it the most comprehensive fiscal stimulus bill in U.S. history, surpassing both Obama's 2009 stimulus and FDR's New Deal. Among its key provisions, the CARES Act introduced an additional $600 per week in unemployment benefits, which was added to state benefits, offering crucial financial support to those who lost their jobs. The bill also created the Paycheck Protection Program, which provided forgivable loans to small businesses to help them retain employees during the crisis. The impact of the legislation was dramatic. In April 2020, just after the bill's passage, personal income in the U.S. saw a historic 10.5% increase, the largest monthly rise in 60 years, despite a sharp increase in unemployment, which surged from 4.4% to 14.7% in the same month. The COVID-19 pandemic set the stage for the 2020 presidential election, creating a backdrop of uncertainty and challenges for both candidates. Haberman notes that Trump was often puzzled and frustrated by the declining turnout at his rallies compared to 2016, with the pandemic playing a major role as many people were unwilling to attend large public events due to health concerns. Haberman also highlights how Trump's difficulties continued during his televised debate with Democratic nominee Joe Biden. She observes that Trump's performance was widely seen as aggressive, hostile, and spiteful. He interrupted Biden repeatedly, mocking him over the death of his son Beau and belittling Biden's other son Hunter for his public struggles with drug addiction. Following the debate, Trump's poll numbers continued to decline. According to Haberman, Trump began telling his aides that he believed the polls were rigged and that the election would be stolen from him. After a tightly contested race, Haberman writes that the major networks declared Joe Biden the winner once he secured crucial victories in key battleground states like Arizona and Georgia. However, Trump found it impossible to accept defeat. According to Haberman, Trump and his team rejected the election results, falsely claiming the election had been stolen. They launched efforts to overturn the outcome, including a strategy to have Republican-controlled state legislatures in swing states send alternate slates of electors to Congress in an attempt to reverse the results. The Trump team's plan to submit alternate electors to Congress was intended to create a dispute over the true election results, potentially stalling the certification of Biden's victory. They hoped this strategy would ultimately push the decision to the GOP-controlled Supreme Court. However, the legal and political maneuvering failed. The Trump team's numerous legal challenges were rejected across the board, with their cases losing almost universally in both state and federal courts. On January 6, 2021, Haberman writes, a large group of Trump supporters gathered outside the U.S. Capitol, encouraged by Trump in the days leading up to the rally. Trump urged his supporters to demand that Congress overturn the results of the election. He also promoted a baseless theory that Vice President Pence had the power to reject the Electoral College votes and appoint Trump for a second term. However, Pence had no such authority and refused to comply with Trump's request. When the crowd learned that Pence had not acted as Trump had hoped, their anger intensified, and the situation quickly became hostile and threatening. By the afternoon of January 6, 2021, Haberman writes, the crowd outside the Capitol turned violent, overwhelming Capitol Police and breaching the building's security. Some of the rioters were armed and organized, with ties to right-wing paramilitary groups. As the chaos escalated, chants calling for the hanging of Vice President Pence echoed through the crowd, while a gallows erected on the National Mall became a chilling symbol of the mob's anger. As the rioters stormed the Capitol, congressional leaders were forced to evacuate, fearing for their safety. Haberman details how the rioters rampaged through the Capitol, causing extensive damage and vandalizing the historic halls. Tragically, 5 people lost their lives during the riot, including a Capitol Police officer. In the aftermath, hundreds of individuals were arrested and charged in connection with the insurrection, as authorities worked to hold those responsible accountable for their actions. A 2023 report by Senator Gary Peters highlights significant intelligence failures by the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, DHS, in the lead-up to the January 6 Capitol attack. According to the analysis, law enforcement agencies failed to act on credible intelligence about potential violence, largely due to poor communication and a lack of coordination among different intelligence entities. Despite possessing warnings of possible threats, the intelligence community did not issue a comprehensive threat assessment, and crucial information was either delayed or not properly shared. The report criticizes the failure to connect scattered pieces of intelligence, which hampered efforts to gauge the full scale of the danger. Additionally, the report raises concerns about the inadequate preparation and response of law enforcement, including the Capitol Police, noting that the agencies were not sufficiently prepared to handle the escalating situation. It calls for improvements in intelligence sharing processes, better training for law enforcement personnel, and enhanced coordination to avoid similar failures in the future and ensure greater preparedness for handling such threats. After leaving office, Trump was impeached for a second time, but Haberman notes that his support among Republican members of Congress remained almost unanimous, with nearly all Republicans in the House and Senate voting against impeachment. In the post-presidency period, Trump continued to deny the results of the 2020 election. Through her interviews with him, Haberman was struck by how openly and frankly Trump seemed to view his presidency as a platform for gaining more fame, attention, recognition, and power. She concludes by observing that Trump had succeeded in realigning and polarizing American politics, with his rages and resentments serving as a broader reflection of the nation's deep and seemingly unbridgeable divisions.